Every night at 9 p.m., Adrian Callahan would disappear into his garage for business calls, but the business he was conducting was destroying lives, and his wife was about to become his final victim. Have you ever noticed your partner being secretive about phone calls? Unexplained expenses on credit cards? Strange absences that don't quite add up? Those late-night conversations behind closed doors that suddenly stop when you walk into the room? For Nora Callahan, these red flags weren't just minor annoyances. They were warning signs of a deadly deception that would cost her everything. What she discovered in that garage would shatter her world and ultimately seal her fate. Stay with me as we uncover how one man's web of lies led to the ultimate betrayal, and why the signs were there all along, hiding in plain sight. Welcome to Maplewood, a place where dreams of suburban perfection came to life. Here, pristine white picket fences bordered emerald lawns that seemed to compete for which could be more flawlessly maintained. Children's laughter echoed from perfectly positioned playsets, while the gentle hum of lawnmowers provided the soundtrack to weekend mornings. Every driveway held gleaming cars, every garden bloomed with calculated precision, and every neighbor exchanged warm smiles that suggested life here was exactly as good as it appeared. On Willow Lane, the blue house with crisp white shutters stood as a testament to this suburban ideal. The Callahan residence commanded admiration from passers-by. Its freshly painted exterior, carefully trimmed hedges, and welcoming front porch swing created a scene that belonged on a postcard. Golden Retriever Jasper could often be spotted lounging in the front yard, his tail wagging at anyone who dared to walk by. The morning newspaper always found its way to the same spot on the porch, and the American flag hung proudly from its mounted pole. But perfection, as we'll discover, can be the most dangerous disguise of all. The Callahan family appeared to embody everything Maplewood represented. Social media feeds overflowed with images of family barbecues, holiday celebrations, and weekend adventures. Their Christmas lights display drew crowds each December, their Halloween decorations became neighborhood legends, and their annual summer pool parties were the social events everyone hoped to attend. To the outside world, they had achieved the American dream: a beautiful home, successful careers, and a young daughter who brought joy to everything she touched. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade, cracks had begun to form. The same garage where Adrian claimed to conduct his important business calls would soon become the epicenter of a web of deception so complex and devastating that it would destroy not just his own family, but countless others who had trusted him. If this story already has you questioning what secrets might be hiding in your own neighborhood, hit that like button and subscribe, because this case will change how you look at the people closest to you. Let me introduce you to the key players in this tragic tale. Nora Callahan represented everything good about small-town America. At 34, she had dedicated her life to nurturing young minds as an elementary school teacher at Maplewood Elementary. Her classroom was a sanctuary of learning where children felt safe to explore, question, and grow. Parents requested her specifically for their children, knowing that Mrs. Callahan's gentle guidance and infinite patience would help their little ones thrive. She volunteered at the local food bank, organized book drives for underprivileged families, and somehow always found time to help a neighbor in need. Her warm brown eyes reflected genuine kindness, and her infectious laugh could brighten even the darkest days. Nora believed in the power of truth, the importance of honesty, and the strength that came from facing difficult situations head-on. These values, which made her an exceptional teacher and friend, would ultimately put her in mortal danger. Adrian Callahan, 36, was Nora's opposite in many ways, charming where she was genuine, calculating where she was trusting. Standing 6 feet tall with the kind of confident smile that opened doors and won favor, Adrian had always possessed an uncanny ability to make people believe whatever he wanted them to believe. He dressed impeccably, spoke eloquently about business ventures and investment opportunities, and carried himself with the assurance of a man who had found success. To the community, Adrian was the entrepreneurial spirit of Maplewood, a consultant who helped businesses maximize their potential while building his own impressive portfolio. His explanations about market trends and financial strategies impressed dinner party guests, and his willingness to offer investment advice to neighbors had earned him respect and admiration. But Adrian's greatest talent wasn't in business, it was in deception. 9-year-old Mia Callahan brought pure joy to every room she entered. With her mother's kind heart and her father's quick wit, she excelled in school, made friends easily, and filled their home with laughter and the constant chatter of childhood discovery. Mia trusted completely, loved deeply, and had no idea that her world was built on foundations of lies. Supporting our story are Clara, Nora's protective older sister who never quite trusted Adrian's smooth explanations, and Detective Rafael Ortiz, a methodical investigator whose attention to detail would prove crucial in uncovering the truth. These 5 lives would become forever intertwined in a case that would expose the deadly consequences of living a double life, and prove that sometimes, the most dangerous person in your life is the one who sleeps beside you every night. The Callahan family's public image was nothing short of extraordinary. Their social media presence painted a portrait of domestic bliss that neighbors and friends couldn't help but admire. Instagram posts showcased family vacations to mountain cabins, beach resorts, and European cities, each photograph meticulously staged to capture moments of pure happiness. Adrian's Facebook timeline featured snapshots of business conferences, networking events, and celebratory dinners marking another successful deal. Every holiday brought elaborate decorations that transformed their home into a neighborhood showcase. Christmas meant thousands of twinkling lights, handcrafted ornaments, and a towering tree visible through their front window. Halloween featured carved pumpkins lining their walkway, while Easter brought pastel displays that drew children from blocks away. These weren't just decorations. They were statements about a family that had time, money, and dedication to create magic. Community events became Adrian's stage for performance. At school fundraisers, he arrived in tailored suits, shaking hands with principals and school board members while discussing his latest consulting projects. He spoke confidently about helping struggling businesses transform their operations, increasing profits and expanding into new markets. His business cards were elegantly designed, his handshake firm, and his explanations about complex financial strategies impressed everyone who listened. Adrian's consulting firm, Pinnacle Strategic Solutions, existed primarily on paper and in carefully crafted conversations. He described clients from coast to coast, tech startups in Silicon Valley needing operational guidance, family restaurants in the Midwest requiring financial restructuring, and manufacturing companies seeking efficiency improvements. His office at home was equipped with multiple phone lines, professional letterhead, and industry publications that suggested serious business activity. The community saw Adrian as a success story, a local man who had built something meaningful from nothing. Real estate agents pointed to the Callahan house as proof that Maplewood attracted ambitious professionals. Financial advisors at the local bank knew Adrian by name and always greeted him warmly when he made deposits or transferred funds between accounts. But social media posts can be carefully curated, business cards can be printed by anyone, and impressive conversations require only confidence and creativity. Nora's unease began subtly, like a nagging headache that wouldn't respond to medication. The first signs appeared as changes in routine, small shifts that might have seemed insignificant to someone who hadn't shared a home with Adrian for over a decade. Those nightly garage conversations became a ritual she wasn't invited to witness. At exactly 9 p.m., Adrian would excuse himself from family time, claiming important clients on the West Coast required his attention. The garage door would close, and for the next hour or more, muffled voices would drift through the walls. When Nora approached during these sessions, the conversations would suddenly stop, followed by long periods of silence before Adrian emerged, claiming technical difficulties or dropped calls. His explanations about business trips grew increasingly vague. Where once he provided detailed itineraries, specific hotels, client meetings, conference schedules, now he offered only destination cities and approximate return dates. "I'll be in Denver until Thursday," replaced the detailed planning that had characterized their earlier years together. Phone calls during these trips were brief and often interrupted, with Adrian claiming poor reception or urgent meetings requiring his immediate attention. Financial inconsistencies began appearing on their shared credit card statements. Charges from restaurants in cities where Adrian claimed to be attending business meetings, but for amounts suggesting multiple people rather than solitary business dinners. Hotel expenses that seemed excessive for standard business accommodations. Cash advances from ATMs in locations that didn't align with his stated travel plans. When Nora questioned these discrepancies, Adrian's responses were swift and dismissive. "You know how these business dinners work. I'm entertaining potential clients." Or, "The company is reimbursing me for these expenses, don't worry about it." His tone carried just enough irritation to discourage further questioning, while his explanations sounded reasonable enough to quiet her concerns temporarily. The man who once shared every detail of his workday now deflected questions about specific projects. "Confidentiality agreements prevent me from discussing client details," became his standard response to inquiries about his consulting work. When friends asked about his business at social gatherings, Adrian would pivot to asking about their careers instead, skillfully redirecting attention away from specifics about his own professional activities. Master manipulators like Adrian understand that successful deception requires consistency, confidence, and careful attention to their audience's psychology. They study the people around them, learning which explanations will be accepted, which questions make their targets uncomfortable, and how to exploit natural human tendencies toward trust and rationalization. Living a double life demands extraordinary mental discipline. Every conversation must be monitored for consistency with previous lies. Every story must align with the carefully constructed narrative. Every relationship must be managed to prevent different worlds from colliding. Adrian maintained detailed mental records of what he had told different people, which explanations he had used in various situations, and which aspects of his fictional business required reinforcement or adjustment. The emotional toll on unsuspecting spouses follows a predictable pattern. Initial doubt gets rationalized away. He's working hard to provide for our family. Concern gets reframed as support. He's under so much stress, I shouldn't add to his burden with questions. Suspicion gets buried under guilt. I should trust my husband instead of looking for problems. Victims often ignore red flags because acknowledging them would require confronting the possibility that their entire relationship is built on lies. The cognitive dissonance between loving someone and suspecting them of deception creates psychological pressure that many people resolve by dismissing their doubts rather than investigating their concerns. Adrian understood that Nora's teacher instincts made her naturally inclined to solve problems and help others succeed. He exploited this by framing his secretiveness as protecting her from business stress and his financial irregularities as complex professional matters she wouldn't understand. Every time she expressed concern, he responded with just enough information to seem transparent while actually revealing nothing substantial. The isolation that accompanies this dynamic is profound. Spouses begin to doubt their own perceptions, question their right to ask for transparency, and feel increasingly disconnected from someone they thought they knew completely. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something wasn't right, but couldn't put your finger on it? That nagging sense that the person you love most might be hiding something important from you? How well do you really know the people in your life? When someone changes their patterns, offers vague explanations for new behaviors, or becomes defensive about simple questions, what does your instinct tell you? For Nora Callahan, these questions were about to become matters of life and death. Tuesday, March 15th began like any other evening in the Callahan household. Nora had returned from parent-teacher conferences, her arms full of student artwork and permission slips requiring signatures. Mia was practicing piano in the living room, her small fingers stumbling through a simplified version of Fur Elise. The familiar sounds of domestic life filled their home. Dinner preparations, homework discussions, and the gentle hum of routine that had defined their marriage for over a decade. The mail sat unopened on the kitchen counter, a daily collection of bills, advertisements, and neighborhood newsletters that typically required little attention. As Nora sorted through the stack while waiting for the oven to preheat, one envelope stood out from the rest. The return address bore the logo of Consolidated Recovery Services, and the letter was addressed exclusively to Adrian Callahan. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the envelope. In 12 years of marriage, she had never seen correspondence from a debt collection agency. Their finances, while not extravagant, had always been stable. They paid their mortgage on time, maintained good credit scores, and lived within their means, or so she had believed. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if the contents carried weight beyond the simple paper inside. Nora placed it prominently on Adrian's desk in the home office, but the image of that return address burned in her memory throughout the evening. When Adrian arrived home from his latest business trip, she watched his face carefully as he sorted through his mail. His reaction was swift and practiced. "Another one of those ridiculous mistakes," he said, barely glancing at the letter before tearing it open. "These collection agencies buy old debt lists and send threatening letters to people who don't owe anything. It's a common scam to pressure people into paying money they don't actually owe." The explanation sounded reasonable, delivered with the same confident tone Adrian used when discussing market trends or business strategies. But something in his eyes, a flash of recognition before the dismissive explanation, suggested this wasn't the first such letter he had received. "What kind of debt do they think you owe?" Nora asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Credit card charges from some company I've never heard of. Probably identity theft or a clerical error. I'll call them tomorrow and get it straightened out." Adrian folded the letter and placed it in his jacket pocket, removing it from further discussion. But he never made that call, and more letters would follow. Over the following weeks, Nora began paying closer attention to their financial statements. What she discovered made her question everything she thought she knew about their economic situation. Their primary credit card statement revealed charges that made no sense within the context of Adrian's explained business activities. A $347 dinner at Le Bernardin in New York City during a week when Adrian claimed to be meeting clients in Chicago. Hotel charges of $892 for a single night at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco, despite Adrian's assertion that his West Coast clients preferred modest accommodations to keep expenses reasonable. The restaurant charges were particularly troubling. Multiple high-end establishments in different cities, always for amounts that suggested elaborate meals for several people. When Nora asked about these expenses, Adrian explained them as client entertainment, necessary investments in building business relationships. But the frequency and extravagance seemed excessive, even for someone allegedly landing major consulting contracts. Cash withdrawals created another pattern of concern. ATM transactions of $500, $800, and sometimes $1,000 appeared regularly on their statements, always from machines in cities where Adrian claimed to be conducting business. When questioned, he explained these as necessary for client entertainment, taxi fares, and business expenses that required cash payments. But the amounts and frequency suggested something far beyond routine business needs. Hotel expenses revealed the most disturbing inconsistencies. Charges from luxury resorts during periods when Adrian claimed to be attending budget-conscious business conferences. Weekend stays at romantic destinations during times when he supposedly had urgent client meetings. Multiple night accommodations in cities where he claimed day-long consultations should have required only brief visits. The math simply didn't add up. If Adrian's consulting business was as successful as he claimed, these expenses should have been covered by client reimbursements. Instead, every charge appeared on their personal accounts, draining their savings and increasing their debt load month after month. The woman who had built her career on helping children distinguish between truth and fiction found herself trapped in a maze of conflicting evidence about her own husband. Every instinct that made her an exceptional teacher, the ability to spot inconsistencies, recognize when someone wasn't telling the complete truth, and identify patterns of deceptive behavior, now pointed toward uncomfortable conclusions about Adrian. Her natural inclination was to investigate, ask questions, and seek clarity. But marriage had taught her different rules. Supporting your spouse meant trusting their explanations, even when those explanations left gaps. Loving someone meant giving them the benefit of the doubt, especially when they were working hard to provide for the family. The internal conflict was exhausting. During the day, she helped 9-year-olds understand the importance of honesty and accountability. At night, she rationalized away evidence that her husband might be lying about fundamental aspects of their life together. The cognitive dissonance created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that affected her sleep, her appetite, and her ability to focus on her students' needs. Isolation compounded her struggle. Who could she talk to about these concerns? Discussing financial irregularities with friends felt like a betrayal of Adrian's privacy. Sharing suspicions with family members risked creating permanent damage to relationships if her fears proved unfounded. Even her sister Clara, who had always been her closest confidant, seemed like a dangerous audience for these particular worries. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. If Adrian was lying about business expenses, what else might he be hiding? If the debt collection letters weren't mistakes, what obligations had he created without her knowledge? If his business trips weren't what they seemed, where was he actually going and what was he actually doing? If you're thinking about someone in your life who shows these warning signs, share this video. It might save someone from Nora's fate. Adrian's response to Nora's growing questions revealed sophisticated techniques designed to maintain control while avoiding direct confrontation. Rather than providing detailed explanations that could be verified or challenged, he employed strategies that shifted focus away from specific facts and toward emotional dynamics. When Nora questioned credit card charges, Adrian responded with expressions of hurt rather than concrete answers. "I can't believe you don't trust me after all these years. I'm working harder than ever to provide for our family, and you're treating me like a criminal." These responses transformed Nora from an investigator seeking information into a wife who needed to justify her suspicions. Gaslighting became Adrian's primary tool for managing Nora's concerns. When she mentioned specific charges or inconsistencies, he would claim she was misremembering details, misunderstanding business practices, or overreacting to normal fluctuations in expenses. "You're seeing problems where none exist. Your anxiety is making you paranoid about routine business activities." He began questioning her memory and perception in subtle ways. When she referenced previous conversations about his travel plans, he would insist she had misunderstood or forgotten important details. When she asked about promised explanations that never materialized, he would claim those conversations had never occurred or had been resolved satisfactorily. The erosion of Nora's confidence was gradual but systematic. Each time she raised concerns, Adrian's responses made her question whether her suspicions were reasonable or whether her own emotional state was creating problems that didn't actually exist. The woman who had once trusted her instincts completely began second-guessing every observation, every question, and every moment of doubt. This psychological warfare was preparing the ground for something far more dangerous than financial deception. While Nora taught children about honesty and integrity, her husband was building a criminal empire that spanned multiple states and destroyed dozens of lives. Adrian's fraudulent activities weren't desperate attempts to solve temporary financial problems. They represented a systematic approach to theft that demonstrated calculated cruelty and sophisticated planning. His online romance fraud operation targeted women over 50 who had recently lost their husbands. Adrian studied obituaries in newspapers across the country, identifying widows who appeared financially stable based on their deceased husbands' professional backgrounds. He created fake profiles on dating websites, using photographs stolen from legitimate social media accounts of attractive men in their 40s and 50s. Michael Harrison was a successful architect working on international projects who needed emergency funds to complete a construction contract in Romania. David Thompson was a military contractor whose assets were frozen due to bureaucratic delays while he completed work in Afghanistan. Robert Sterling was a wealthy businessman whose accounts were temporarily inaccessible during a complex merger negotiation. Each identity came with elaborate backstories, carefully crafted to explain why a successful, attractive man would need financial assistance from a woman he had never met in person. Adrian spent hours researching construction terminology, military protocols, and business procedures to make his stories believable. He learned enough about architecture to discuss building codes, enough about military operations to reference deployment schedules, and enough about corporate finance to explain complex merger processes. His investment schemes targeted middle-class families looking to improve their financial situations. Adrian presented himself as a consultant who helped clients access exclusive investment opportunities normally reserved for wealthy individuals. He claimed connections with hedge fund managers, real estate developers, and technology startups that offered guaranteed returns far exceeding traditional investments. The Ponzi scheme among his college acquaintances was perhaps his cruelest operation. These were people who had known Adrian for decades, who trusted him based on shared memories and long-standing friendships. He convinced former classmates to invest retirement funds in a fabricated venture capital fund that promised to specialize in emerging technology companies. Managing multiple criminal identities required extraordinary organizational skills and psychological discipline. Adrian maintained detailed files on each victim, tracking their personal histories, financial situations, emotional vulnerabilities, and communication preferences. He created separate email accounts, phone numbers, and even mailing addresses for different personas. His home office contained multiple phones and computer systems dedicated to different aspects of his criminal operations. Encrypted hard drives stored victim profiles, financial records, and correspondence histories for dozens of ongoing scams. A locked filing cabinet held printed copies of important documents, backup records, and contingency plans for various scenarios. Adrian's planning was meticulous. He researched each victim's background thoroughly before making initial contact, learning about their interests, family situations, and financial circumstances. He studied their social media profiles, public records, and any available information about their personal lives to craft approaches that would resonate with their specific needs and desires. The psychological aspects of his deception were equally sophisticated. Adrian understood that successful fraud required emotional manipulation as much as financial trickery. He learned to identify loneliness, insecurity, and desperation in his targets, then positioned himself as someone who could provide companionship, validation, and financial security. For romance fraud victims, he became the perfect companion, attentive, romantic, and understanding in ways their previous relationships had never been. He remembered birthdays, asked about grandchildren, and provided emotional support during difficult times. The financial requests came only after months of building genuine emotional connections. Investment fraud victims received a different approach. Adrian presented himself as someone who recognized their intelligence and ambition, someone who believed they deserved better financial outcomes than traditional investments could provide. He made them feel special, chosen for exclusive opportunities that weren't available to ordinary investors. The adrenaline rush of successful deception became addictive. Each successful scam provided not just financial rewards but psychological satisfaction from outsmarting his victims and maintaining his elaborate deceptions. Adrian thrived on the challenge of juggling multiple identities, crafting believable stories, and extracting money from people who trusted him completely. The financial scope of his operations was staggering. Over 5 years, Adrian had stolen more than $800,000 from victims across the country. Individual losses ranged from $5,000 to $150,000, representing life savings, retirement funds, and emergency reserves that victims had accumulated over decades of hard work. Margaret Peterson, a 67-year-old retired librarian from Ohio, lost $87,000 to Michael Harrison. 6 months after her husband's death from cancer, she met the charming architect online. Over 8 months, he convinced her to send money for equipment deposits, customs fees, and emergency medical expenses. The funds came from her husband's life insurance policy, money she had planned to leave to her grandchildren. James and Patricia Miller, both teachers from Colorado, invested their entire $45,000 retirement account in Adrian's fabricated venture capital fund. They believed they were securing their financial future and helping innovative technology companies succeed. When Adrian stopped returning their calls, they discovered that their retirement dreams had vanished along with their savings. Robert Chin, Adrian's college roommate, convinced 3 other alumni to invest $200,000 collectively in the fake fund. These men had trusted Adrian based on 20 years of friendship, shared experiences, and what appeared to be his legitimate business success. The betrayal destroyed not just their finances but their faith in human relationships. Adrian selected victims based on specific psychological and financial profiles. Widows who appeared isolated and financially stable made ideal romance fraud targets. Middle-class families with modest savings but ambitious financial goals were perfect for investment schemes. College friends who had achieved professional success but lacked sophisticated investment experience were vulnerable to Ponzi operations. His manipulation techniques were tailored to each victim type. Lonely widows received constant attention, romantic gestures, and promises of companionship. Investment victims were made to feel intelligent and privileged, chosen for exclusive opportunities. College friends were approached through shared memories and mutual acquaintances, making the fraud feel like helping an old friend rather than a risky investment. By early 2023, maintaining his criminal empire was becoming increasingly difficult. Several romance fraud victims had begun comparing notes through online support groups, discovering similarities in their experiences with different men who all claimed to need emergency funds for international projects. Investment scheme victims were demanding returns that Adrian could no longer provide without recruiting new investors at an unsustainable rate. His paranoia intensified as law enforcement agencies in multiple states began receiving complaints about online romance fraud and investment schemes matching his methods. Adrian monitored news reports about fraud investigations, changed his operating procedures frequently, and began planning exit strategies for his most vulnerable operations. The psychological toll of maintaining dozens of simultaneous deceptions was enormous. Adrian needed perfect recall of which lies he had told to which victims, which promises he had made to different people, and which explanations he had provided for various delays and complications. The mental exhaustion of being constantly on as multiple characters was affecting his sleep, his health, and his ability to function normally. Nora's growing suspicions added another layer of stress to his already overwhelming situation. Every question she asked required careful consideration. Would his answer be consistent with previous explanations? Could she verify his response through credit card records or other evidence? Was she beginning to connect dots that could expose his entire operation? His desperation manifested in increasingly risky behavior. Adrian began taking larger amounts from new victims to satisfy existing obligations, accelerating the timeline of his schemes in ways that made them more likely to be discovered. He started making mistakes in his communications, confusing details between different identities and sending inappropriate messages to wrong recipients. The collision between his criminal world and his family life was becoming inevitable. Every day brought new demands from victims, new complications from ongoing scams, and new evidence that Nora was getting closer to discovering the truth about his activities. This case teaches us that financial abuse often precedes physical violence. The warning signs are there if we know how to look. When someone controls information, deflects questions about money, and creates financial secrecy within relationships, they are establishing patterns of control that can escalate into more dangerous behaviors. Adrian's treatment of Nora followed the same psychological manipulation techniques he used on his fraud victims. The gaslighting, the emotional deflection, and the erosion of her confidence were not separate from his criminal activities. They were part of the same controlling mindset that allowed him to steal from strangers and ultimately threaten the person closest to him. Understanding these connections can help us recognize when financial deception might be masking more serious dangers, and why confronting the truth, as terrifying as it might be, is sometimes the only path to safety. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of quiet that settles over suburban neighborhoods when children are at school and adults are absorbed in their weekday routines. Adrian had left that morning for what he described as a 3-day consulting engagement in Philadelphia, his travel bag packed with the same precision that characterized all his business trips. For the first time in months, Nora found herself alone in their house with both the time and the courage to seek answers to questions that had been consuming her thoughts. The home office had always been Adrian's exclusive domain. In 12 years of marriage, he had made it clear that his business materials required confidentiality and that her presence in the room was unwelcome except for the most necessary household tasks. The door remained closed when he worked, and even when he was away, Nora had respected these boundaries without question. But respect had given way to desperation. The debt collection letters had multiplied, arriving weekly with increasingly urgent language. The credit card charges had grown more frequent and more extravagant. Adrian's explanations had become shorter, more dismissive, and less convincing. The woman who had built her career on helping children distinguish between truth and fiction couldn't ignore the evidence that her own husband was lying about fundamental aspects of their lives. Standing outside the office door, Nora's hands shook as she turned the handle. The room smelled of Adrian's cologne and the leather chair where he spent hours conducting his mysterious business calls. Everything appeared meticulously organized, files arranged alphabetically, desk surface cleared except for essential items, and computer equipment positioned with mathematical precision. The locked drawer in his desk had always intrigued her. Unlike the other drawers that contained ordinary office supplies and business documents, this one required a key that Adrian kept on his personal keychain. But desperation had made her resourceful, and after 20 minutes of careful searching, she found a spare key taped underneath the desk's middle drawer. Her trembling fingers fumbled with the lock before it finally clicked open. What she discovered inside would forever change everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her husband, and her own safety. The encrypted hard drive sat alongside stacks of cash bound with rubber bands, 20s, 50s, and hundreds totaling what appeared to be several $1,000s. But it was the leather notebook that captured her attention most completely. The cover was worn from frequent handling, and the pages inside contained handwritten entries that read like a catalog of human misery. Each page of the notebook represented a different victim, organized with the precision of a business ledger. Names, addresses, phone numbers, and brief personality profiles filled the margins alongside financial information that revealed the scope of Adrian's criminal activities. Margaret Peterson, Ohio widow, $87,000 life insurance, lonely, trusts easily, loves gardening, was followed by detailed notes about her deceased husband, her grandchildren's names, and her emotional vulnerabilities. Below that, a timeline tracked the progression of their relationship and the amounts of money she had sent to Michael Harrison over 8 months. James and Patricia Miller, Colorado teachers, both $44,000-$45,000 retirement account, ambitious but naive about investments, came with notes about their professional backgrounds, their financial goals, and their susceptibility to promises of exclusive investment opportunities. Page after page revealed similar entries. College friends, lonely widows, ambitious families, all reduced to potential profit margins and exploitation strategies. Adrian had cataloged their hopes, fears, and financial situations with the detached precision of a scientist studying laboratory specimens. The notebook contained names that linked to news articles Nora remembered reading about financial fraud victims. Stories she had dismissed as unfortunate but distant tragedies now carried the weight of personal involvement. Her husband wasn't just reading about these crimes, he was committing them. Cross-references between the notebook and printed email conversations revealed the elaborate lies Adrian had constructed for each victim. Romance fraud targets received passionate love letters from men who didn't exist. Investment fraud victims saw fabricated financial documents promising guaranteed returns. College friends received updates about fictional business ventures that would make them all wealthy. The financial calculations were staggering. Adrian had stolen more than $800,000 over 5 years, with individual victims losing amounts ranging from $5,000 to $150,000. These weren't just numbers, they represented life savings, retirement funds, and emergency reserves that real people had accumulated through decades of hard work. As the full scope of Adrian's criminal enterprise became clear, Nora's emotional control finally collapsed. She sat on the office floor, clutching the notebook while tears streamed down her face. The man she had loved, trusted, and built a life with was a stranger who had been systematically destroying other people's lives while living comfortably on the proceeds of their suffering. With shaking hands, Nora used her phone to photograph every page of the notebook, every stack of cash, and every piece of evidence she could find. The encrypted hard drive was beyond her technical abilities, but the handwritten records provided enough information to understand that Adrian's crimes extended far beyond what she had imagined possible. Her first call was to Clara, her older sister who had always provided steady guidance during life's most difficult moments. Clara had never fully trusted Adrian's smooth explanations and confident demeanor, often expressing quiet concerns about his vague business activities and expensive lifestyle. "Clara, I need you to come over right now," Nora said, her voice barely steady enough to form words. "I found something in Adrian's office. Something terrible." Clara arrived within 30 minutes, and together they examined the evidence that would forever change their understanding of Adrian's character. Clara's background in accounting allowed her to quickly grasp the financial implications of what they had discovered, while her protective instincts immediately focused on Nora's safety. "We need to contact the police," Clara said, her voice firm despite the shocking nature of the evidence. "These people deserve to know what happened to their money, and you deserve to know the truth about who you've been married to." But they also recognized the immediate danger. If Adrian discovered that his secrets had been exposed, his reaction might be unpredictable and potentially violent. Men who were capable of systematically stealing from vulnerable people might be capable of other forms of harm when cornered. They developed a careful plan. Nora would confront Adrian when he returned from his business trip, demanding complete honesty about his criminal activities. If he refused to cooperate or became threatening, she would leave immediately and contact law enforcement. Clara would remain close by, ready to provide support and assistance if the situation became dangerous. The weight of betrayal settled over Nora like a suffocating blanket. Every memory of their marriage now carried the taint of deception. Every romantic gesture, every family vacation, every moment of apparent happiness had been financed by the suffering of innocent people who had trusted Adrian just as she had trusted him. The 3 days until Adrian's return felt like the longest of Nora's life. She maintained her normal routines, teaching her classes, helping Mia with homework, attending school meetings, while carrying the enormous burden of what she had discovered. Every interaction with neighbors who respected Adrian, every casual mention of his successful business, every moment of ordinary life felt like participation in an elaborate lie. Her determination to confront the truth warred with her fear of what that confrontation might bring. Adrian had shown himself capable of deceiving everyone who trusted him, including the woman who had shared his bed for 12 years. If he could steal from widows and destroy college friendships without apparent remorse, what might he do when faced with the complete exposure of his criminal empire? When Adrian's car pulled into their driveway on Sunday evening, Nora watched from the kitchen window as he gathered his luggage and walked toward their front door with the same confident stride that had characterized their entire marriage. In a few minutes, she would discover whether the man she had loved was capable of honesty when faced with undeniable evidence of his crimes. The calm before the storm was about to end, and nothing would ever be the same again. Dusk settled over Willow Lane like a curtain closing on the final act of a tragedy. The golden hour light that usually made their neighborhood look like a postcard now cast long shadows that seemed to anticipate the darkness about to engulf the Callahan home. Street lamps flickered to life one by one, illuminating the perfect lawns and pristine sidewalks that had always represented safety and stability. Inside their blue house with white shutters, Nora sat in the living room with the leather notebook hidden beneath a throw pillow on the couch. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she heard Adrian's key in the front door, followed by the familiar sounds of his return, luggage dropping in the entryway, keys hitting the ceramic bowl on the hall table, his confident footsteps approaching the living room. "How was Philadelphia?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the turmoil that had consumed her for the past 3 days. "Productive," Adrian replied, loosening his tie with the same casual confidence that had characterized thousands of similar conversations. "The client was impressed with my recommendations. We should see a significant contract extension." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, just as hundreds of other lies had rolled off his tongue during their 12 years of marriage. But this time, Nora knew the truth about his business trips and his consulting work. She pulled the leather notebook from beneath the pillow, placing it on the coffee table between them with deliberate precision. The worn cover seemed to glow in the lamplight, a testament to the countless hours Adrian had spent cataloging his victims and planning their destruction. Adrian's reaction was instantaneous and revealing. His confident expression vanished, replaced by a look of recognition followed quickly by calculation. The charming mask that had fooled neighbors, friends, and family for years slipped away, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Where did you find that?" His voice had changed completely, losing its warm familiarity and taking on an edge that Nora had never heard before. "In your locked drawer, along with stacks of cash and an encrypted hard drive." Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I know about Margaret Peterson. I know about the Miller family. I know about your college friends who trusted you with their retirement savings." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it lasted only seconds. In that quiet space, the fundamental dynamic of their relationship shifted permanently. Adrian was no longer the successful businessman providing for his family, and Nora was no longer the trusting wife who accepted his explanations without question. "Who are these people, Adrian?" Nora's voice grew stronger as she opened the notebook to a random page. "Margaret Peterson lost $87,000 to someone she thought loved her. The Millers lost their entire retirement account. These are real people whose lives you've destroyed." Adrian's initial response was to attempt the same deflection techniques that had worked for years. "You don't understand how business works, Nora. Those entries aren't what they look like. I help people with their investments and sometimes..." "Stop lying to me." The force of her own voice surprised her. "I've read every page of this notebook. I've seen the fake identities, the romance scams, the investment frauds. You're not a consultant, Adrian. You're a criminal who steals from people who trust you." For the first time in their marriage, Adrian's confident explanations weren't working. Faced with undeniable evidence and a wife who refused to be manipulated, he shifted tactics to threats and intimidation. "If you go to the police, you'll destroy everything we've built together," he said, his voice taking on a menacing quality that made Nora's skin crawl. "Think about Mia. Think about her friends, her school, her future. Do you want her to grow up knowing her father is in prison? Do you want her to suffer because you couldn't mind your own business?" The manipulation was expertly crafted to exploit Nora's deepest fears and strongest instincts. As a mother, the thought of causing her daughter pain was almost unbearable. As a teacher, she understood how deeply children could be affected by family trauma and social stigma. But Adrian had underestimated the strength that comes from finally understanding the truth. The woman who had spent months questioning her own perceptions and doubting her own instincts had found clarity in the pages of his victim ledger. "You're using our daughter as a shield for your crimes?" Nora replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her body. "These people you've stolen from, they have children and grandchildren too. They trusted you the same way I trusted you, and you destroyed their lives without a second thought." Adrian's attempts at emotional manipulation grew more desperate. He reminded her of their wedding vows, their shared memories, the life they had built together. He promised to stop his criminal activities if she would just keep quiet and give him a chance to make things right. But each word only reinforced what Nora had already realized. The man she had married was a stranger who had been performing the role of loving husband while systematically destroying innocent people's lives. The moment that sealed both their fates came when Nora spoke words that had been building in her heart for 3 days of devastating revelations. "I can't live a lie anymore, Adrian." Her voice was quiet but absolutely firm. "I won't be part of this deception. I won't pretend that our marriage is real when it's built on the suffering of people who trusted you. I won't teach my students about honesty and integrity while staying silent about your crimes." Something fundamental shifted in Adrian's demeanor when he realized that manipulation, threats, and promises weren't going to work. The desperate edge in his voice was replaced by something far more dangerous. A cold calculation that suggested he was considering options that had nothing to do with persuasion. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, his tone dropping to barely above a whisper. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can destroy my life and face no consequences?" The atmosphere in their living room became charged with an energy that made Nora's survival instincts scream warnings. The man sitting across from her was no longer attempting to preserve their relationship or protect their family. He was assessing her as a threat that needed to be neutralized. "I'm going to pack a bag and stay with Clara," Nora said, standing up from the couch with as much dignity as she could manage. "Tomorrow, I'm going to contact the police and tell them everything I've discovered. You can use the time to decide whether you want to turn yourself in or wait for them to arrest you." Adrian's eyes followed her movement with predatory focus. "You're not going anywhere. If this confrontation has you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on." because what happens next will shock you. The transformation that occurred in Adrian during this confrontation illustrates a well-documented phenomenon in criminal psychology. When narcissistic individuals who have built their identities around control and manipulation are faced with complete exposure, they often experience what psychologists call narcissistic rage, a state of fury triggered by threats to their carefully constructed self-image. For years, Adrian had maintained power through deception, keeping his victims isolated and dependent on the false realities he created for them. Nora's refusal to be manipulated represented more than just personal rejection. It threatened the entire foundation of his criminal enterprise and his sense of superiority over the people he exploited. Cornered criminals become most dangerous when they realize that their usual tactics are no longer effective. Adrian's shift from manipulation to menace reflected a desperate calculation. If he couldn't control Nora through emotional manipulation, he would need to consider more direct methods of preventing her from exposing his crimes. The tragic irony of this situation is that Nora's courage in confronting the truth, the same moral strength that made her an exceptional teacher and mother, was about to put her in mortal danger. The very qualities that Adrian had once claimed to love about his wife were now the qualities that made her a threat to his freedom and his carefully constructed false identity. In cases involving financial fraud and domestic violence, the moment of truth-telling often becomes the moment of greatest danger, as perpetrators realize that maintaining their deception through psychological manipulation is no longer possible. The decision to leave filled Nora with a mixture of terror and relief. For the first time in months, she knew exactly what she needed to do, even though every step toward the truth brought her closer to danger. Adrian had retreated to his office after their confrontation, claiming he needed to think about what she had said, but the closed door and muffled phone conversations suggested he was planning something far different from honest reflection. Moving quietly through their bedroom, Nora packed a small overnight bag with essentials, clothes for a few days, important documents, and the few pieces of jewelry that held genuine sentimental value. Each item she folded represented a choice between the lie she had been living and the truth she was determined to embrace, regardless of the consequences. Her hands shook as she gathered Mia's school schedule, medical records, and favorite stuffed animal. Whatever happened next, she needed to ensure her daughter's safety and stability. Clara had already agreed to pick up Mia from school the next day and explained that Mommy was dealing with some grown-up problems that required temporary changes to their routine. The plan was straightforward: spend the night at Clara's house, contact the police first thing in the morning, and provide them with all the evidence she had discovered about Adrian's criminal activities. The victims whose names filled his leather notebook deserved justice, and the people he was currently scamming deserved protection from further harm. As she moved through their home, past the family photos that now seemed like props in an elaborate performance, past the furniture they had chosen together during happier times, past the kitchen where they had shared thousands of meals, Nora felt like she was walking through a museum dedicated to a life that had never really existed. The decorative candlestick on the mantel caught her attention as she passed through the living room. It had been a wedding gift from Adrian's mother, a heavy brass piece that had always seemed too formal for their casual decorating style. She touched it briefly, remembering how proud Adrian had been to display it prominently, claiming it represented the solid foundation of their marriage. How wrong they had all been. Behind the closed office door, Adrian was experiencing the first complete breakdown of his carefully controlled criminal empire. The phone call to Victor, his longtime accomplice who had helped facilitate several investment scams, revealed the full scope of his desperation. "She knows everything," Adrian whispered into the phone, his usual confidence replaced by raw panic. "She found the notebook, the cash, all of it. She's threatening to go to the police tomorrow." Victor's response was immediate and practical. "Get out now. Take whatever cash you can carry and disappear. I can have a car waiting in 2 hours, and we can get you across state lines before anyone knows you're gone." But Adrian's pride warred with his survival instincts. Running would mean abandoning everything he had built in Maplewood: his reputation, his social standing, his carefully crafted image as a successful businessman. It would mean admitting that his criminal activities had finally caught up with him and that he was nothing more than a common thief fleeing justice. "I can't just disappear," Adrian replied, pacing frantically around his office. "I have a life here. I have responsibilities. Maybe I can convince her to keep quiet, give her time to understand the consequences of destroying our family." Victor's laugh was bitter. "She's not going to keep quiet. Women like her don't back down once they've made up their minds about what's right and wrong. You have two choices: run or face decades in prison." The mental breakdown that followed was complete and devastating. Adrian, who had spent years maintaining perfect control over dozens of simultaneous deceptions, found himself unable to think clearly about even basic decisions. Should he pack clothes? How much cash could he carry without attracting attention? Which identity documents would he need for a completely new life? But every plan for escape came back to the same obstacle: Nora's determination to expose his crimes. As long as she was alive and committed to telling the truth, no amount of distance would protect him from the consequences of his actions. The sound of her footsteps in the hallway interrupted his frantic planning. Through the office door, he could hear her moving toward the front of the house, her overnight bag creating a soft shuffling sound against the wall. She was actually leaving. She was actually going to destroy everything. Adrian intercepted Nora at the front door, where she stood with her coat buttoned and her overnight bag clutched in her trembling hands. The woman who had confronted him with such courage in their living room now looked fragile and vulnerable, understanding that she was about to step into an uncertain future with no guarantees about her safety or her daughter's well-being. "Please don't do this," Adrian said, his voice carrying a pleading quality that might have seemed genuine to someone who didn't know about his years of manipulation. "Think about what you're destroying. Think about Mia growing up without her father, about the shame and humiliation she'll face when her classmates learn what happened." Nora's response was quiet but absolutely firm. "I'm thinking about the children of all the people you've stolen from. I'm thinking about Margaret Peterson's grandchildren who won't get the inheritance she planned to leave them. I'm thinking about the Miller family's dreams of retirement that you destroyed for your own selfish purposes." The moral clarity in her voice triggered something primal in Adrian's psychology. This wasn't just rejection, it was judgment. Nora wasn't just threatening his freedom, she was declaring that his entire way of life was morally bankrupt and that she would rather destroy their family than continue living his lies. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Adrian said, his tone shifting from pleading to threatening. "You have no idea what you're starting." "I know exactly what I'm starting," Nora replied, reaching for the door handle. "I'm starting to tell the truth." The brass candlestick from their mantel was within arm's reach as Adrian felt his last vestiges of control disappearing. The woman he had manipulated for years was walking away from him, choosing justice over loyalty, choosing other people's welfare over his protection. The blow came without conscious thought, a moment of rage and desperation that transformed a decorative wedding gift into a weapon. Nora staggered, her overnight bag falling to the floor as she collapsed onto the hardwood entryway. The silence that followed was deafening. Adrian knelt beside his wife's motionless body, his mind struggling to process what he had done. The woman who had loved him, trusted him, and built a life with him lay dead because she had chosen truth over deception. Panic replaced rage as Adrian realized the full implications of his actions. Murder would bring scrutiny that would expose not just this single moment of violence but his entire criminal enterprise. Every victim, every scheme, every carefully hidden detail of his fraudulent life would be examined by investigators. His first priority was eliminating evidence of their confrontation. He wiped down the candlestick and returned it to the mantel, hoping to suggest that Nora's death had been accidental. He cleaned blood from the entryway floor and rearranged furniture to hide signs of their struggle. Using Nora's phone, he sent carefully crafted text messages to Clara. "Need some time to think. Staying with a friend for a few days. Don't worry about me." The messages were designed to buy him time while he developed a more comprehensive plan. The most challenging aspect of his cover-up was disposing of Nora's body and creating a believable explanation for her disappearance. He loaded her into her own car and drove to Riverside Park, where he left the vehicle in a location that suggested she had gone there voluntarily before continuing on foot to an unknown destination. But panic made him careless. He forgot to remove the overnight bag from their entryway, left fingerprints on surfaces he should have cleaned, and failed to account for the timing inconsistencies that would later prove crucial to the investigation. The man who had successfully deceived dozens of victims was about to discover that covering up murder required skills he had never developed. Clara Martinez had received thousands of text messages from her younger sister over the years, and she knew Nora's communication style as well as she knew her own handwriting. The message that arrived Tuesday evening: "Need some time to think. Staying with a friend for a few days. Don't worry about me," was wrong in every possible way. Nora never used phrases like, "Don't worry about me." When she needed space or support, she called rather than texted, wanting the comfort of hearing Clara's voice. More importantly, Nora had never in her adult life made major decisions without discussing them thoroughly with her sister first. The idea that she would suddenly disappear without explanation was completely out of character. The timing made Clara's concerns even more acute. Just 3 days earlier, Nora had called in a state of extreme emotional distress, asking Clara to come over immediately because she had found something terrible in Adrian's office. They had spent hours examining evidence of his criminal activities and developing a plan for Nora to confront him safely. Clara had expected daily updates about how that confrontation had proceeded. Instead, she received a single impersonal text message that sounded nothing like her sister's voice, followed by complete silence when she tried to call Nora's phone repeatedly. Her call to the Maplewood Police Department was met initially with standard responses about adults having the right to travel without notification and the 48-hour waiting period typically required before filing missing person reports. But Clara's persistence and specific concerns about Adrian's behavior convinced the dispatcher to escalate her call to Detective Rafael Ortiz. "My sister discovered evidence that her husband is running multiple fraud schemes," Clara explained to the detective. She was planning to confront him and then contact police. "The text message I received doesn't sound like her at all, and she's not answering her phone." Detective Ortiz had learned to trust family members' instincts about their loved ones' behavior patterns. In his 15 years of investigative work, he had seen too many cases where relatives' concerns were dismissed only to later prove tragically accurate. Detective Ortiz's reputation in Maplewood was built on meticulous attention to detail and an almost supernatural ability to spot inconsistencies that other investigators missed. His colleagues joked that he could find evidence in a pristine laboratory, but his thoroughness had solved cases that others had written off as unsolvable. Walking through the Callahan residence for the first time, Ortiz noted details that Adrian's frantic cleaning had failed to address. The house appeared almost too perfect. Surfaces that seemed recently scrubbed, furniture positioned with mathematical precision, and an overall sense of forced orderliness that suggested recent and thorough cleaning efforts. The entryway revealed the first concrete signs that something violent had occurred. A dining room chair was positioned at an odd angle, as if it had been moved hastily rather than placed deliberately. Microscopic blood spatter on the baseboards had survived Adrian's cleaning attempts, invisible to casual observation but detectable under the detective's experienced scrutiny. The mantelpiece drew Ortiz's particular attention. The brass candlestick appeared to have been recently polished, its surface gleaming in a way that contrasted with the other decorative items in the room. When he examined it more closely, trace amounts of blood and hair were visible in the intricate engravings that would have been difficult to clean thoroughly. Nora's overnight bag remained in the master bedroom closet, a crucial oversight in Adrian's cover-up efforts. If Nora had truly left voluntarily to stay with friends, she would have taken the bag that Clara confirmed she had packed for her planned departure. Adrian's explanation for his wife's absence, that she had become overwhelmed by stress and needed time alone to think, contradicted everything the detective was observing. The physical evidence suggested violence, while Adrian's demeanor suggested deception rather than genuine concern for his missing wife. Clara's decision to share the photographs Nora had taken of Adrian's criminal records transformed the investigation from a simple missing person case into a complex fraud and murder inquiry. The images revealed a criminal enterprise far more extensive than anything Detective Ortiz had encountered in Maplewood's typically quiet suburbs. Each page of Adrian's leather notebook represented a separate crime, and many of the victims' names connected to fraud reports that had been filed with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The scope of his operations required coordination with federal authorities and financial crime specialists who could trace the complex money transfers and false identity documents Adrian had used. Financial records from the Callahan family's bank accounts revealed the extent to which Adrian had been funding his lavish lifestyle through stolen money. Deposits that coincided with successful scams, withdrawals that matched amounts sent by fraud victims, and a pattern of financial activity that correlated perfectly with the criminal timeline documented in his notebook. Former victims began coming forward as news of the investigation spread. Margaret Peterson contacted police from Ohio, providing detailed records of her 8-month relationship with Michael Harrison and the $87,000 she had sent to help with his fabricated construction project. The Miller family drove from Colorado to provide testimony about their lost retirement funds and their devastation upon learning that their trusted friend had systematically stolen their life savings. College acquaintances who had invested in Adrian's fake venture capital fund shared emails, financial documents, and recorded phone calls that demonstrated the sophisticated nature of his deception. Each new piece of evidence reinforced the conclusion that Adrian was a career criminal whose fraud operations had been escalating in scope and audacity for years. The timeline of deception that emerged from this evidence painted a picture of a man whose criminal activities had been discovered by his wife just days before her disappearance. Exactly the scenario that would create maximum motivation for violence. Adrian's attempts to maintain his innocence became increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted against him. His initial claims about Nora's voluntary departure were contradicted by physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own inconsistent statements to investigators. When confronted with the criminal evidence Nora had discovered, Adrian shifted his strategy to admitting limited wrongdoing while denying any involvement in his wife's disappearance. He claimed that his fraud activities were business mistakes that had gotten out of hand and that Nora had overreacted to discovering them. But his explanations for the timing of Nora's disappearance made no logical sense. If she had simply needed time to process her disappointment in his business practices, why hadn't she contacted her sister? Why had she left her overnight bag behind? Why had her car been found abandoned at Riverside Park with no indication of where she had gone next? Each interview with Detective Ortiz revealed new inconsistencies in Adrian's story. Details about his last conversation with Nora changed between tellings. His timeline for when he had last seen her alive shifted to accommodate new evidence. His explanations for the physical evidence in their home became increasingly implausible. The community's reaction to the unfolding investigation was one of complete shock and disbelief. Neighbors who had admired Adrian's apparent success struggled to reconcile the charming man they knew with the evidence of systematic fraud and suspected murder. Parents who had trusted him with investment advice discovered that their children's college funds had been placed at risk by his criminal activities. The perfect suburban facade that had protected Adrian for years was finally collapsing under the weight of truth, but the cost of that truth was measured in destroyed lives, shattered trust, and the tragic death of a woman whose only crime was believing that honesty was more important than protecting a lie. The Maplewood County Courthouse had never seen anything like the trial of Adrian Callahan. For 6 weeks, the typically quiet building buzzed with activity as reporters, legal observers, and community members filled every available seat to witness the prosecution of a man who had hidden his criminal empire behind the facade of suburban respectability. Prosecutor Sarah Chin methodically presented evidence that demonstrated the full scope of Adrian's deception. Financial experts testified about the sophisticated nature of his fraud schemes, explaining how he had manipulated banking systems, created false documentation, and managed multiple identities with the precision of a criminal mastermind. The most powerful moments came when Adrian's victims took the witness stand. Margaret Peterson, now 71 and forced to return to work as a grocery store clerk, described how Michael Harrison had convinced her to empty her late husband's life insurance account. Her voice trembled as she explained that the money was supposed to provide security for her remaining years and a small inheritance for her grandchildren. James and Patricia Miller testified about the devastating impact of losing their retirement savings to Adrian's fake investment fund. Patricia broke down while describing how they had trusted Adrian because of his college friendship with James, believing that shared history guaranteed honesty. Their dreams of retiring to a small cabin in the mountains had been replaced by the reality of working into their 70s to rebuild what Adrian had stolen. Robert Chin, Adrian's former college roommate, provided some of the most damning testimony about the personal betrayal involved in the Ponzi scheme. "He sat at our kitchen table, held our baby daughter, and convinced us to invest our daughter's college fund in his fake company," Robert said, his voice filled with pain and anger. "He looked us in the eye and stole our child's future." Adrian's defense attorney struggled to present any coherent explanation for the overwhelming evidence. The defendant himself remained largely silent throughout the proceedings, occasionally whispering to his lawyer but never taking the stand to explain his actions. The confident, charming man who had once commanded respect in Maplewood social circles now appeared defeated and isolated, abandoned by the community that had once admired him. Expert witnesses explained the psychology of financial predators, helping the jury understand how Adrian had selected vulnerable targets and exploited their emotional needs for his own profit. The testimony revealed that his crimes weren't desperate acts born of financial necessity but calculated attacks on people whose only mistake was trusting someone who appeared successful and caring. The revelation of Adrian's true nature sent shockwaves through Maplewood that extended far beyond the courthouse. Neighbors who had considered the Callahans their closest friends struggled to reconcile their memories of barbecues and holiday parties with the evidence of systematic fraud and murder. Real estate agent Linda Morrison, who had used the Callahan family as an example of Maplewood's appeal to potential buyers, found herself fielding uncomfortable questions about how well residents actually knew their neighbors. "People are asking if there are other Adrian Callahans living among us," she explained to local reporters. "The sense of trust that made this community special has been damaged." Parents at Maplewood Elementary School, where Nora had taught for 8 years, organized memorial services and support networks for students who were struggling to understand their beloved teacher's disappearance. The school established a garden in Nora's memory, where children could plant flowers and remember her lessons about kindness, honesty, and helping others. 9-year-old Mia Callahan was placed in Clara's custody, beginning the difficult process of rebuilding her life after losing both parents. One to murder, one to prison. Child psychologists worked with her to process the trauma of learning that her father had killed her mother, while Clara provided the stability and love necessary for healing. The community's response included calls for increased vigilance about financial fraud and domestic violence. Local police began offering educational workshops about recognizing the warning signs of financial abuse, while domestic violence advocates emphasized that economic control often precedes physical violence in abusive relationships. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder, multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. The foreman's voice was steady as he announced each guilty verdict, but the weight of the decision was evident in the solemn faces of the 12 men and women who had listened to weeks of testimony about betrayal, theft, and murder. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Adrian Callahan to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Nora's murder, plus additional consecutive sentences totaling 60 years for his financial crimes. Her words during sentencing reflected the community's sense of betrayal and loss. "Mr. Callahan, you systematically destroyed the lives of people who trusted you, culminating in the murder of your own wife when she threatened to expose your crimes," Judge Williams said. "Your actions have shattered families, destroyed retirement dreams, and taken the life of a woman whose only crime was believing in truth and justice." Adrian's final moments as a free man revealed a complex mixture of defiance and regret. As bailiffs approached to escort him from the courtroom, he turned toward the gallery where his victims and community members sat. For a brief moment, his expression seemed to reflect genuine remorse for the pain he had caused. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold detachment that had characterized his criminal activities for years. Justice had been served, but the cost could never be fully calculated. Victims would spend years rebuilding their financial lives, while Mia would grow up without her mother and with the knowledge that her father was a murderer. The scars left by Adrian's deception would mark the Maplewood community for decades to come. If this case has opened your eyes to hidden dangers, please share it with someone who needs to see this. Your awareness could save a life. In the months following Adrian's conviction, Maplewood transformed its grief into meaningful action that would honor Nora's memory while protecting others from similar tragedies. The Nora Callahan Memorial Scholarship Fund was established at Maplewood Elementary School, providing educational support for children from families affected by domestic violence or financial fraud. Each year, 3 students receive assistance with school supplies, tutoring, and enrichment activities that Nora would have provided personally if she had lived. The community garden planted behind the elementary school became a living testament to her belief in nurturing growth and new beginnings. Families tend plots where vegetables and flowers flourish under the same sun that once warmed Nora's classroom, while children learn lessons about patience, care, and the importance of strong roots, values that Nora had emphasized throughout her teaching career. Educational workshops on financial manipulation became monthly events at the Maplewood Community Center, led by financial crimes experts who help residents recognize the warning signs of fraud schemes. These sessions cover romance scams, investment fraud, and identity theft, empowering community members with knowledge that could prevent them from becoming victims like those Adrian had targeted. Support groups for fraud survivors meet weekly, providing safe spaces where people can share their experiences and rebuild their confidence after being deceived by financial predators. Margaret Peterson became a volunteer facilitator, using her own painful experience to help others understand that being victimized doesn't reflect personal weakness but rather the sophisticated nature of modern fraud operations. The case of Adrian and Nora Callahan illuminated patterns that experts now emphasize in domestic violence and financial abuse prevention education. Partner secrecy about financial matters represents one of the most significant red flags. When someone becomes defensive about bank statements, credit card charges, or business activities, it often indicates deception that extends beyond simple privacy preferences. Unexplained financial changes deserve immediate attention and investigation. Mysterious charges on shared accounts, cash withdrawals that don't align with stated activities, and lifestyle expenses that exceed apparent income sources all suggest potential fraud or hidden financial problems that could escalate into dangerous situations. Growing isolation from family and friends frequently accompanies financial manipulation, as abusers work to eliminate outside perspectives that might question their control tactics. When partners begin discouraging communication with siblings, limiting social activities, or creating barriers between their victims and support networks, the isolation serves to protect their deceptive activities from scrutiny. The importance of trusting instincts cannot be overstated. Nora's initial concerns about Adrian's behavior were accurate, even when his explanations seemed reasonable. That persistent feeling that something wasn't right represented her subconscious mind processing inconsistencies that her conscious mind was trying to rationalize away. Mental health professionals emphasize that these instinctive warnings deserve serious consideration rather than dismissal. Detective Ortiz's reflections on the case emphasize the connection between financial crimes and domestic violence. In my experience, people who are willing to systematically steal from strangers are often willing to harm family members who threaten their criminal activities, he explains. Financial abuse frequently escalates to physical violence when victims attempt to expose or escape the deception. Therapists who work with domestic violence survivors point to the psychological manipulation techniques Adrian used on both Nora and his fraud victims. Gaslighting, emotional manipulation, and the gradual erosion of confidence are common tools used by abusers to maintain control over their targets. Dr. Patricia Kim, who counsels fraud survivors, notes that financial predators select victims based on emotional vulnerabilities, then exploit those vulnerabilities to maintain psychological dominance. The cycle of financial abuse leading to violence follows predictable patterns that professionals now recognize as warning signs. Initial charm and apparent success give way to secrecy and control, followed by manipulation and intimidation when victims begin questioning the deception. When psychological control fails, physical violence often becomes the next escalation. Community vigilance and prevention efforts focus on education, early intervention, and support networks that make it difficult for predators to operate undetected. Neighbors, friends, and family members who understand these patterns can provide crucial support for potential victims while also recognizing when law enforcement intervention might be necessary. The tragedy of the Callahan family demonstrates how perfectly maintained facades can conceal devastating realities. Adrian's success in deceiving his entire community for years illustrates the sophisticated nature of modern deception and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating the people we trust with our emotional and financial well-being. The price of deception in relationships extends far beyond the immediate victims to affect children, extended families, and entire communities. Mia Callahan will spend her lifetime processing the trauma of her father's crimes and her mother's murder, while the Maplewood community continues to struggle with questions about trust and safety in their previously secure environment. Transparency and honesty serve as protective shields against manipulation and abuse. Healthy relationships require open communication about finances, clear explanations for unusual behaviors, and mutual respect for each partner's right to understand and question significant decisions that affect their shared life. The courage required to confront difficult truths, as Nora demonstrated in her final days, represents the only reliable protection against becoming complicit in deception. Her decision to investigate Adrian's activities and demand honesty ultimately cost her life, but it also exposed crimes that had destroyed dozens of other lives and prevented him from claiming additional victims. Today, Maplewood looks much the same as it did before Adrian Callahan's crimes were exposed. The same tree-lined streets wind through neighborhoods where families continue their daily routines, children play in well-maintained yards, and neighbors wave to each other with familiar warmth. But beneath this surface normalcy lies a changed community, one that has learned the devastating lesson that evil can wear the most convincing masks. The echoes of that fateful night continue to reverberate through the lives of everyone Adrian touched. Mia, now a teenager living with Clara, has grown up strong and resilient despite the trauma that defined her childhood. The Memorial Garden at Maplewood Elementary School still blooms each spring, reminding students and teachers that even in the darkest circumstances, new life can emerge from devastation. Justice was served when Adrian Callahan received his life sentence, but the scars he left on his victims and community remain. Margaret Peterson still works part-time at 75, rebuilding the retirement security that Adrian destroyed. The Miller family achieved their dream of retirement, but years later than planned and with the constant awareness that trust must be earned through transparency, not charm. This case teaches us a universal lesson about the hidden dangers that can exist in the most familiar places. The greatest threats to our safety and security often come not from strangers in dark alleys, but from people who have earned our trust and gained access to our most vulnerable spaces, our homes, our hearts, and our financial security. For anyone watching this, remember, The dangers we face are often closer to home than we suspect. The person sleeping beside you, managing your investments, or claiming to love you might be hiding secrets that could destroy your life. This isn't about becoming paranoid or suspicious of everyone around you. It's about maintaining healthy boundaries and expecting transparency in relationships that affect your well-being. The importance of vigilance in everyday life cannot be overstated. Pay attention when explanations don't make sense, when financial situations seem inconsistent, or when someone becomes defensive about questions you have every right to ask. Your instincts exist for a reason, and ignoring them in the name of trust or politeness can have devastating consequences. Honesty and transparency serve as our most reliable protection against deception and manipulation. Healthy relationships, whether romantic, financial, or professional, require open communication and mutual respect for each other's right to understand decisions that affect shared interests. The shield of awareness against deception is built through education, communication, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Nora Callahan's tragic death reminds us that sometimes the price of remaining silent about dangerous secrets is higher than the cost of speaking truth, no matter how difficult that truth might be to face. If this story has impacted you, please give this video a like to help us reach others who need to hear these important lessons. Your engagement helps us continue investigating these cases and sharing the warning signs that could prevent future tragedies. Subscribe to True Crime Dossier for more deeply researched cases that examine not just what happened, but why it matters for your own safety and awareness. We don't just tell stories, we provide the insights and education that could protect you and your loved ones. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Your awareness could save a life by helping others recognize the warning signs of financial abuse, domestic violence, and fraud schemes that destroy families and communities. Comment below with your thoughts on the warning signs we discussed. Have you experienced similar red flags in your own life? Your insights could help other viewers recognize dangerous patterns before they escalate. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the cases that reveal important truths about human nature, criminal behavior, and personal protection.